Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohenbacher.
And you know what? It is survey time. As many of you know, 2819 is a viewer-supported ministry, and we would love to hear from you. So for the next couple of weeks, if you visit reasons.org/2819, you'll find a survey there, and we'd love to hear from you.
That's right. We enjoy the partnership that we have with our viewers, and we want to make sure that we build the show around your outreach needs. So just remember reasons.org/2819. You can get the survey there.
All right. Well, now it's time for a quick rundown of today's episode. What we got cooking today?
Yes, we're going to have a mix of RTB scholars and some of our visiting scholars. This includes Hugh Ross, infectious disease physician Francisco Delgado. That was a lot to say.
Yep.
And we
Good
also
job.
Thanks. We also have geology and geological engineering professor Gregg Davidson.
I think I got the easy words. They'll be addressing topics such as who were the Nephilim, is carbon-14 dating reliable, and how we can reconcile science and Christianity.
This is going to be like a really deep and informative show. There's some great
Right?
topics.
Yeah.
First up, we have Culture Talk. Sandra will be talking with astrophysicist Jeff Zweerink about the Betelgeuse supernova. Can you say that 3 times?
Betelgeuse. Never mind. Let's check it out. Welcome to Culture Talk. This is the segment where we discuss culturally relevant topics to equip you to share your faith more effectively. I'm joined with Jeff Zweerink, astrophysicist. Hello.
Hi, Sandra. It's good to be here.
I'm glad that you're joining us because we're going to be talking about something that's been in the news lately, and that's Betelgeuse, but not Michael Keaton's character,
Right, no.
the supernova.
Well,
So-
it's a star that we think might go supernova. Yeah.
So first, what is Betelgeuse?
So Betelgeuse is just a really big star. For everybody up here in the Northern Hemisphere, if you go out at night in the winter, you can see the constellation Orion. It's the upper left star in Orion. It's often one of the brightest stars, but the cool thing about it is it's a variable star as well. So it's one of those just really interesting stars, and so it's been in the news because it's been changing a little bit lately.
So what has happened, because it has been in the news everywhere, and not just in like scientific journals, it's been in the popular news.
Right.
What's going on with it?
Well, what happened is that it's gotten dimmer than it normally has. So it's a variable star, and it changes in brightness quite a bit. But for kind of probably a confluence of a couple of different effects, it's gotten dimmer than it normally has. And so some people are saying, oh, it may be in the process of collapsing to go supernova. So that's kind of what's going on. It's not quite so dramatic as that, but that's part of why it's made it into the popular press.
So there's this possibility maybe that it might supernova or explode. What would that mean for us? Like, how far is it? And given its size, like, what would that mean for us here on Earth?
Yeah, it's a few hundred light years away, maybe 1,000 light years away. So probably to first order, not much would happen. I mean, it's going to get really bright. It's going to give off a lot of light, a lot of energy, but all that's going to be contained largely around the star. There's going to be some radiation that come off that may have some smaller effects here. But to a first approximation, not much is going to happen on Earth if that goes off. So supernova are big things, but space is really big. And so it's probably not going to be a big deal.
Yeah. Speaking of big, how big is it compared to our
It is a
sun?
really cool star. We don't know exactly how large it is, but given our estimates, if you were to take Betelgeuse and put it in place of the sun in our solar system, it would be at least the size of Earth's orbit, if not the size of Jupiter's orbit.
Yeah.
So this is a massive star. It's anywhere from probably 15 to 20 solar times the mass of the sun. So it's burning very quick, or burning all of its hydrogen and all of its fuel up really quickly. It's been doing that for probably 1 million years. And whether it's tomorrow, which is probably not, somewhere within the next 100,000 years, it's going to go supernova. So it's not a matter of if, but when it will, but probably not in my lifetime, which is a bummer because I think it would be so cool to see.
We like explosions, right?
I do.
Yeah.
I love, and that's the arguably the biggest,
safe
one of the
ones,
biggest
but-
explosion you can have in the galaxy or in the universe. So
I think you had written about that in your devotional impact events, that if you could be safe but witness a supernova, you would love to do that.
yeah, it's like once we're resurrected and have indestructible bodies, it's like, okay, up front, right when a supernova goes off, just
With
to see
popcorn.
what it's like there. Man, all the popcorn would get blown away.
Yeah.
But
So now we know its size, it's super huge, and we know that it's so many light years away.
Right.
What does that tell us about the universe? given its size and its distance from
Well,
us.
it's one of the cool things is that because a lot of things astronomically happen on long time scales. So this is a supernova or a star that will go supernova fairly recently by astronomical standards, but we're still talking 10,000, maybe 100,000 years. But by being able to see lots of different stars in different phases, we can get a picture of what's going on in the universe. And so this is a star that burns its fuel up really quickly, but we can see kind of the end stages of that. We can see other stars that are much younger, other stars that are lighter that are going to take much longer. And so it gives us a picture of just this awesome universe we live in and for the billions of years that it's been around and what all's gone on in that time. And so it's one of a bit of data that gives us a more complete picture of how the universe behaves.
So you talked about like billions of years. So when we detect something like Betelgeuse, that tells us, and is that the only way to interpret it, that it is billions of years? Or is there a way to interpret it from, say, a young Earth perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure if you go look at any one thing, you could probably say, well, okay, this could be this. But if you're looking to say, hey, we want to find a general explanation that accounts for all the different stars that we see and all the different supernova and the nova and the bright stars and the dim stars, when you put all that together, a lot of that boils down to some relatively basic physics that if we apply that basic physics, it says, yeah, the universe really is millions and billions of years old. And so I'm not going to say it's not possible, but the most parsimonious, the one that gives the simplest explanation to account for the most wide-ranging effects is that the universe really is a few billion years old. So.
Well, that's helpful then. So when we're having conversations with someone who is, maybe they're not a Christian and they're excited about, because what we see in the popular news, it's like, it seems almost like it's on the verge of exploding.
Right.
So like, maybe like in June or whatever, but it's not.
I'm hoping for December. It'd be brighter that way.
Right,
No, I'm
right.
joking.
So, that's kind of I think the reason why people are excited, because it's like something fascinating is happening in the universe. And that's something to be excited about. Now, it's not happening right around the corner, but when we have conversations with non-Christians, how can we kind of interject our understanding from a Christian perspective of how the universe behaves?
Well, I think that's one thing. People generally who are fascinated about this are kind of interested in science and what science has to say. And so the better we understand the science, the more we can articulate what's going on and being able to come in and say, yeah, Betelgeuse, it's going to go supernova, probably not now, not get caught up in the hype and understand the science well so that we can talk about it. That does give us a credibility now when we bring in and talk about how this may point to a creator or how Jesus came and walked on the earth. We built up a credibility that they're more likely to listen to us. And so I think that credibility is important because I know for me, if somebody's lost their credibility, I don't listen to what they have to say on much of anything until it's rebuilt some way. And so being able to talk about the science well is a way to build that credibility.
Yeah, that's an important reminder. So do you have any resources that you would point people to kind of help get equipped and understand something like Betelgeuse?
I would go to our website, reasons.org. Typically, we've talked about something like that. I don't know that there's anything specifically about Betelgeuse, but honestly, if I'm honest, if I want to go find basic information about something, I'll go look at Wikipedia. That's a great place to start. It's not the final answer, but then so that gives me information about how large is the star, where is it, what's actually going on. But then also that science faith component, look on our website, see what we have to how to make that transition into, hey, this actually points towards a creator, and this is what's cool about it.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jeff. Excellent tips. If you want to hear more on this topic, visit reasons.org. Now we're going to head to our Nexus segment, and we're going to hear from Francisco Delgado, and he'll talk about how he can reconcile Christianity with science. Let's check it out.
Well, I'm joined today by Dr. Francisco Delgado, who is a Christian and also a physician who specializes in infectious diseases to help unpack that question. Paco, welcome.
Thank you, Pastor. Glad to be here.
What would you say to somebody who says there's conflict between science and Christianity?
The basic answer to that would be, I do not see any conflict between science and Christianity. And then we need to unpack a little bit on what does that mean for different people, because many people come from different backgrounds and they have a preconception of what is Christianity and what is the realm of science. From my perspective, when I became a Christian, I was pretty much into the sciences. Science has such an explanatory power that it really drew me into accepting it as a paradigm for the universe in itself. It was only when I went through a supernatural experience that I had to change that view and realize that it was not just this natural world, but also I had to give explanation for the supernatural world and for the possibility of the existence of God. And when I started to find that those conflicted with each other, what I've always fell back on is that if there is a God, this is a God of truth. And that truth should apply in all of the areas of life, of science, of religion. So whenever I saw a conflict, I would then say, okay, let me look at the facts, gather all the information that I can get, because I am sure that I'll be able to find the truth. It's just that maybe at some point I wasn't able to see it.
So from your standpoint, if there's a perception of conflict, then what you're saying is that many times that perception of conflict is due to an incomplete data set, and that as you expand the data set, what many times looks like conflict turns into harmony.
That is correct. And that lack of facts could be from the scientific community, but it also can be from a religious community. Those two areas really have to agree to each other if we're talking about a God of truth, yes.
Okay, and so why do you think then there's this perception that science and Christianity are in conflict? What do you think is the source of that viewpoint? Because it's rather common both in the church and outside the church, right?
Correct. I think it may boil down to a lack of dialogue, of true willingness to see other person's point of view and what their assumptions are about somebody else's worldview.
To hear more from Dr. Francisco Delgado, please visit the Reasons to Believe YouTube channel. Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about the early chapters of Genesis is astrophysicist Dr. Hugh Ross. Welcome back, Hugh.
Well, thank you.
Now, Hugh, one of the distinguishing features of Reasons to Believe is that we actually believe that Genesis 1 through 11 is real history, not allegory, not myth. So talk to me a little bit about why you believe that.
It's written that way, Krista. I mean, if it was meant to be some kind of parable or figure, I would expect to see language to support that. Rather, what I see in the text is every effort being taken by the author to say, I'm telling you about real chronological history.
Now, some people would say, though, there's some weird things happening in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. One of those things is the mention of these mysterious people called the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6. So if you believe that's real history, start to walk us through what do you think is happening there?
Well, like with any controversial issue in the Bible, you want to look at all 66 books, not just what you see in Genesis 6. And it turns out this subject pops up again and again as you look at other books of Scripture. So it's something I've done in navigating Genesis, to actually provide the reader with all the relevant passages in the rest of Scripture and basically challenge them to read them and draw their own conclusion.
So who do you think the Nephilim are? Because they kind of are tied into the flood account with Noah. They happen right before that, before we're introduced to Noah. So what do you think's going on there?
Well, it says in Genesis 6 that they were present before the flood and after the flood. So there's two inputs of the Nephilim going on. And what you see in Genesis 6 is that they're the result of the sons of God visiting the daughters of men. And evidently this was happening before the flood and happened after the flood. And as you go on in the rest of the chronologies of the Bible, you see they show up again, often with different names, like the Anakites or the Rephaim and the Nephilim. They're all interchangeable terms. And what you notice is the last appearance you see of them is in the King David. King David's mighty men wiped out the last of the Nephilim.
So who do you think that they are? Like, what are some of the features that we notice from Scripture about the Nephilim?
Well, they're tall. I mean, the shortest one we see mentioned is Goliath, and using the shortest possible cubit in Hebrew measure, he's at least 9 feet 9 inches tall. Then you got the king of Bashan, who had a bed that was at least 13 feet long, made out of iron. So these were big people. The other thing you notice is no mention of women. They're all men. And they have birth defects, like 6 fingers and 6 toes. We also know they're all evil. None of them are good. But they were mighty men in battle. And they were a threat to the emerging Hebrew nation and Hebrew religion. So that's why God set up a procedure where they could be eliminated from the human race.
When we start talking about people who are 9 feet, 13 feet tall, I can't relate to that in our modern context. What do you think's going on there?
Well, what you see in Navigating Genesis, I got a little piece called The Physics of Basketball, basically making the point that the taller you are in basketball, with equal skill, you'll sink twice as many baskets as the square of your height. And so in basketball, height is everything. On the other hand, what we notice is once you get past about 7 feet tall, the mobility drops. Your best basketball players are not the tallest basketball players because of the loss of mobility. And you're really dealing with the law of gravity. There's a reason why we don't have land animals that are bigger than elephants. If they're bigger than elephants, gravity is going to result in them having serious injuries. These individuals were tall and able to carry a minimum, in terms of Goliath, 250 pounds of weaponry and armor into battle. A human that was that tall would not even be able to get out of a wheelchair. So there's something peculiar about these Nephilim. I argue there has to be something supernatural about them because they're literally violating the laws of physics.
Okay, now I'm getting really curious because you're saying that there's something supernatural about them. I feel like there's something behind that. What are you talking about?
Well, that's where I think it's really interesting to actually do a word study on the sons of God, because it says the sons of God came to the daughters of men and gave rise to these Nephilim. Who are these sons of God? And what I did in Navigating Genesis is give you every passage in the Bible that talks about children of God and sons of God and contrast it with sons of men and children of men. I also do the same thing with Jesus of Nazareth, when he's referred to as a son of man and when he's referred to as a son of God. And what I'm hoping the reader will notice, there's a demarcation right at the day of Pentecost. Before the day of Pentecost, humans are never called sons of God. After the day of Pentecost, believers in Jesus Christ are only called children of God. They're not called sons of men. Likewise, Jesus is only referred to as a son of man before the day of Pentecost. After the day of Pentecost, you see this in the epistles, he's only called the Son of God. So it's making a theological point here, but the theological point tells us there's something non-human about these sons of God. Keep in mind the term sons of God has 2 possible definitions. They can be angels or they can be humans. But evidently, this word study tells us humans who have not yet been baptized in the Holy Spirit cannot be referred to as sons of God. The only passage in the Old Testament where humans are referred to as sons of God is a prophecy where it says a day will come when you'll become sons of God. So again, I think this point about the day of Pentecost is important. I think it also helps deal with another question. Why did Jesus never refer to himself as a son of God during his incarnation? He was making a theological point.
Okay, so if they were angels, I'm still not quite clear about how that helps me determine who the Nephilim are.
Well, go to Jude 6. Jude 6 talks about a subcategory of evil angels, the fallen angels, the demons, who left their estate. And because they left their estate, they were consigned to the abyss, a place that the demons don't like at all. It's what's quite clear when you read the Gospels. Every time Jesus cast out demons, it don't send us to the abyss. Jude is indicating it's a special place for demons who cross the line.
Well, it's a very interesting hypothesis, and I know that there are other competitors.
Right,
This
right.
isn't the only one. What would be your recommendation as people study Genesis 6 for themselves, how to think this through?
Well, what I did in Navigating Genesis is lay out the 3 predominant hypotheses, give people the scripture passages, and tell them read these passages and draw your own conclusion.
Very good. So that gives us a little homework to
Right.
think about.
Yeah.
Very good, Hugh. And I do want to encourage all of you to check out Hugh's blog. Just search for Today's New Reason to Believe at the reasons.org website. Now let's go over to Jeff Zweerink. He's talking to our friend Gregg Davidson about carbon dating. Let's check it out.
Jeff Zweerink here, and welcome back to Give and Take. We've got a special episode today. We're actually filming on set at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting. And I'm excited today because I have a friend and a colleague, Gregg Davidson, and we're going to be looking at this question. Is radiocarbon dating reliable? Gregg, I'm excited to have you on the show today. I know you're a department chair at the University of Mississippi. You've got a background in geology. And you're even saying you had something to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Kind of tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for having me. During my PhD work, which was in the previous millennium, I was actually doing work in the University of Arizona's radiocarbon lab, which was the same lab that dated the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Shroud of Turin. So it's pretty interesting work there.
That's actually pretty cool. And you know, one of those things to me that gives validity to radiocarbon dating is that we're using that to actually establish the timing of biblical artifacts. And but you know, as it is, carbon dating seems to get a bad reputation in the Christian community, or at least some segments of it. Kind of what is it about the dating technique? How does it work? Give us a brief overview of that.
So it's dependent on C14 that's being continuously produced in the atmosphere.
Okay, so carbon-14 is a different isotope than the normal carbon we deal with.
Right, so carbon-12, carbon-13 are stable, they don't change. Carbon-14 has an extra neutron,
right,
makes it unstable, and over time it converts back to nitrogen.
Okay.
So the plants and animals are taking up that C14 from the atmosphere all the time.
Right.
It's also decaying all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But once they die, they're no longer bringing any new C14 in, and so the clock is now ticking. And over time, that C14 level gets lower and lower and lower and lower, and so we're measuring that level, considering what the decay rate of carbon-14 is, and then turning that into an estimate of age.
So in essence, things will build up carbon-14. We're measuring how much carbon-14 there is now. You're kind of dating when they died, if you will.
Yes,
when
exactly.
When that thing's died. Okay. So the basic process seems simple. There's half-lives, and it's 5,000 some odd years. You know, there's lots of details there. But what I'm particularly interested in was this paper that you've published that looks at other ways to validate the legitimacy of the radiocarbon dating. Kind of give us some background on what those other techniques that you use are.
Yeah, so it's addressing the problem that, especially within the church, arguments are made against the validity of radiocarbon dating, with claims that assumptions are made that are not testable, that it's based on things like circular reasoning, and that lines of evidence are not independent from each other. But over the last few decades, very detailed measurements of tree rings, so the carbon-14 that's in tree rings, that going back, covering about a 14,000 year period, and now very detailed records of what appears to be annual sediment layers in some lakes, particularly one in Japan, allow us to begin to combine independent data sets in ways that allow us to very rigorously test both the assumptions of conventional dating and what particularly the young Earth community will claim, trying to say that it's not trustworthy.
So what we've got going on there is, you know, with the tree rings, each tree grows a new ring every year, so you can actually just count those. So that's a very reliable way of doing that. Presumably, that's what's going on with the sediments. Is these varves are layers in lakes where you can count them yearly?
That's the idea, but what the objection will be raised is that perhaps because of environmental perturbations in the past, that maybe trees put on multiple rings in a year. Or maybe that those layers in the lakes are not annual, but were the result of perturbations where we got many, many layers all at once. Perhaps during a global flood. And not discounting the reality of a flood, but when we're looking at could that explain the data or invalidate carbon-14, by combining those data sets, we're actually able to test whether those objections are valid or not.
So that's actually very fascinating. So you got the carbon-14 out of the tree rings that presumably you're sampling each tree ring and doing carbon dating on it.
Yes.
You're also looking at material in the lake layers, if you will, and being able to date that with carbon-14. And then you're able to count both of them, or both the layers in the tree rings and in the lakes. And so if you had a flood that presumably laid down a bunch of layers, what would you expect as contrasted to these layers are all in a year and carbon-14 is reliable? What are the differences you would see there?
Right. So if all of the conventional understanding of radiocarbon is correct, and of tree rings, and of varves, there's actually a very narrow range of expected carbon-14 levels in rings and varves as you go back in time.
Okay.
And if the claims of the young Earth community with everything being explained by a flood were true, we would also be able to, we would expect to see deviations from that expected range in very predictable ways. And what we actually find is that the amount of carbon-14 that's in the tree rings and the amount of carbon-14 that's in those varves lines up beautifully in that narrow range of expected carbon-14 levels, assuming that, if all of the understanding of conventional science is actually true.
Yeah, and there's a plot in your paper that I just found remarkable and very visually compelling, and we'll just describe it. But it's, you plot the age versus carbon-14, the age versus the tree rings, the age versus the varves, and they all just line up dead on back to well over 10,000 years, if I remember correctly.
Actually, back to about 50,000.
50,000 years.
Yeah, which is, by the way, a common misconception about carbon-14, that people think that carbon-14 is being used to date the Earth age.
Yeah.
Yeah, carbon-14, because of its small half-life, is only good to about 50,000 years before there's too little of it left to measure accurately.
Right, yeah, that makes sense.
Or reliably. So and I'll just make one correction, that the beauty of that plot is it's not dependent on an age at all per se.
Right.
It's just a ring count. So looking at the amount of carbon-14 versus ring count or varve count, and if each one of those counts represents a year, then we would expect the data to fall within that narrow range, and it does.
And it does,
which gives great confidence that yes, in fact, the ring count and the varve count does equal years.
I just find that a very fascinating thing, and I appreciate the work you've done, and I just appreciate the time to be here and talk with you about it today.
Yeah.
When we look at radiocarbon dating, it really does get a bad reputation in the Christian community. But what's remarkable is that we can actually go out and test whether it's a reliable technique. And it turns out that it's a very reliable technique. And so we can use it to date the Dead Sea Scrolls and Hezekiah's Tunnel and the other things that we can use to date it show that the Earth is really pretty old, but it also lines up very beautifully that this is a tool we can use to trust that the Bible gives us good things, but also that our measurements of creation are correct. I would encourage you to go to reasons.org, and there's an article called Multiple Lines of Evidence Support an Ancient Earth, where you can get more information about this paper and how you can use it to spread the gospel to those around you.
That does it for us this week. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and that will help you share your faith with confidence and compassion.
Don't forget you can subscribe to the show and also search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear from you.
And if you want the podcast version of 2019, you can get that wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast. And just a big shout out and thank you to all of our podcast subscribers for supporting the show and just being in there with us, listening and not having to see us, right?
Thanks, folks. And we'll see you next week.